McDonald's isn't a random part of everyday life. It shows up so often that people almost stop questioning it. The strange part is that most people already know it isn't the best option, yet they keep coming back again and again. And that doesn't happen because they don't care. It happens because, in so many situations, there just aren't many other practical choices left that are worth thinking through. No one really sits down and says, I'm choosing McDonald's. It happens in very ordinary moments, when there's no time left, when the energy is gone, when everything has to happen right now. Little by little, something that once felt like a choice turns into a reflex. And maybe the issue isn't McDonald's itself. Maybe it's everything that made it the easiest option left. No one wakes up in the morning thinking they're going to eat fast food today. It doesn't begin as a decision, it begins as a day that's unfolding like any other. A morning starts a little later than planned. A phone call runs a few minutes longer. Traffic backs up where no one expected it. Small things, but together they're enough to change the rhythm of the entire day. Some people don't finish work until it's already dark outside. Not because they wanted to stay longer, but because time never seemed to stand still for a single moment that day. And when a day stretches out like that, the first thing that changes isn't your appetite or your eating habits. It's how much energy you have left to even think about what you're going to eat. There are brief moments when someone is standing in front of several familiar options, but instead of comparing them, they only have enough leaf to go with the simplest one, the one that doesn't ask for any extra preparation. Some people say they don't have time to cook. But in reality, what they're missing isn't cooking time. It's having enough space in the day for cooking to become something they can keep doing consistently. According to the USDA, tens of millions of people live with uncertainty around their daily meals, not because food isn't available, but because their schedules are no longer steady enough to support cooking at home every day. And when that pattern repeats itself, meals stop being something that's planned ahead. They become something that's decided in the small gaps between everything else that's still going on. There are evenings when someone stands in the kitchen for a few seconds, looks into the refrigerator, then quietly closes the door. Not because there's nothing to eat, but because every option requires one more step of preparation, and there's simply not enough energy left that day to take it. So everything moves in the easier direction, not because it's the best choice, but because it's the choice that can happen right then and there. And it's in moments that small that a day stops being defined by long-term plans. Instead, it's defined by whatever can be finished immediately. There's something people rarely talk about on days like that. Not every decision is made with the same level of mental energy. Some choices happen when there's still plenty of time to think. Others don't appear until the very end of a day that's already drained almost all of your focus. And at that point, what's left isn't comparison. It's simply the ability to get something done without making the day feel any heavier than it already does. And when a day is shaped by moments like these, what changes isn't just what people eat. It's how they begin to approach choices that once felt completely familiar. A choice doesn't always arrive as a clear, deliberate decision. Sometimes it's simply what's left, after every other possibility has been stripped away by a day that's slowly coming to an end. And in those moments, certain familiar places begin to appear again, not as destinations, but as reflexes woven into the rhythm of everyday life. But to understand why those places keep appearing at exactly those moments, we have to look at something else. Not at how people make decisions, but at how those choices are gradually reflected back into everyday life over time. McDonald's hasn't really changed that much over time. On the surface, it's still the same familiar menu, the same fast service, and nearly the same experience, no matter which location you walk into. But what has changed isn't McDonald's, it's the way people walk into it. There are seasons of life when meals are a clearly defined part of the day. You have time to think about what you want to eat. You have room to weigh your options. You have the peace of mind to make a choice. But there are other seasons when the day runs longer than expected, when work doesn't end on time, When one thing after another keeps piling up without ever slowing down, at those moments, eating no longer stands on its own as a decision. It becomes something that happens alongside everything else. And in a rhythm like that, McDonald's doesn't show up as a carefully considered choice. It shows up as something that's always there at the exact moments when there's no room left to think through anything else. No prep, no waiting, no extra effort. Sometimes, if you look closely enough, people aren't really choosing McDonald's in the traditional sense. They're simply following the path with the least resistance at that moment. Some stop in after work. Some pull in during the middle of a long day. Some just don't have enough left in them to think of another option. But all of those situations meet at the same place, a day with very little room left to pause. That's why McDonald's feels almost like a mirror. Not a mirror reflecting food, a mirror reflecting the pace of people's lives. And when you look at it that way, the question is no longer whether McDonald's is good or bad. The question becomes what has made one simple choice appear over and over again in everyday life. There's something else that's rarely talked about in that very moment. Repeated choices don't just reflect convenience, they also reflect how fragmented the hours of a day have become, and how little space people have left to simply stop before moving on again. And once that question comes into view, the story begins to move to another level. A McDonald's burger doesn't begin at the restaurant. It starts in a chain of processing steps that take place long before the food enters the distribution system. The beef is sent to industrial processing facilities, where it's cut into standardized portions. The meat is then pressed through metal molds to create a uniform thickness, making sure every patty has the same shape before moving to the next stage. After that, it's rapidly chilled in a low temperature environment to lock in its structure before being packaged and sealed. The potatoes come from large scale farming operations. Once they arrive at the processing plant, they go through high pressure washing systems that remove dirt and debris from the surface. Next, they pass through automated sorting systems that separate them by size and shape. The potatoes that meet the standard are cut using high pressure water jets, then go through a brief heat treatment to stabilize their structure before being frozen. From there, the ingredients are packaged in controlled environments and moved into refrigerated transportation. Specialized trucks follow fixed routes, connecting multiple distribution points before delivering shipments to regional warehouses. At every stop, the ingredients don't change state. They simply move into the next stage of storage under the same controlled temperature conditions. Once they arrive at the restaurant, every component goes into the on-site storage system. The beef is held in temperature-controlled equipment or heated according to specific time standards. The fries are cooked in oil, kept at a consistent temperature by sensor-controlled systems. The buns are stored under fixed conditions to maintain their condition before assembly. Each burger is assembled according to a standardized sequence that's applied to every order. That system operates across more than 40,000 locations worldwide and serves roughly 69 million customers every day. The entire chain is designed as one continuous flow, with each stage performing a specific role in moving ingredients from their raw state to the finished product. There are no random steps anywhere in that process. Every component stays within tightly controlled specifications to ensure consistency from one end of the system to the other. There are moments in the day that don't begin with a clear decision. The car simply slows down as it passes a familiar entrance, then turns in without any meaningful pause. There's no long moment of thought, no weighing different options, just a movement that happens in rhythm with the flow of traffic behind it. Once inside, the path begins to narrow into a fixed route. The car moves forward, then stops for a brief moment. Straight ahead is the menu board, divided into smaller sections, each one allowing only a few seconds to glance at before moving on. There's no way to take in the entire board during a single stop. The car pulls forward again. The distance between each stop stays almost exactly the same, creating a continuous rhythm from one point to the next. Each stop lasts only long enough for one short action before it's time to move again. Eventually, the car reaches the order point. A voice comes through the speaker asking for a choice within a very short window of time. At the same moment, Another car has already pulled up close behind. The space ahead doesn't get any bigger, and backing up isn't an option. Right in the middle of that flow, something very small happens. The display changes while the car is stopped. A few items appear, others disappear, and there's no longer enough time to go back and look at everything again. Everything exists only for the brief moment the car is standing still. Then comes the final stop. The food is handed over in just a few moments, and the car leaves the line. There are no long pauses between any of the steps. Everything connects into one continuous movement without interruption. Across that entire sequence, what stands out isn't any individual action. It's the way each stop doesn't just divide time, it also divides what people are able to notice in that moment. Some things only appear while the car is stopped, and the instant movement begins again, they disappear from view without leaving any obvious trace. From the outside, the entire process looks remarkably simple, but from the inside, it's a chain of brief moments where everything is decided within windows that are never quite long enough to come to a complete stop. And from those tiny windows, the entire experience gradually takes shape in a fixed rhythm, repeated from one location to another without changing its underlying structure. The car is still moving through the same line, but what changes isn't outside. It's what happens during those brief moments of waiting between each stop. When the car pauses, there's a very small window before a response has to be made. During that time, the person inside isn't processing a large amount of information all at once. What they usually see is only the information directly in front of them, changing each time the car moves forward. There's no time to go back to the beginning. In some situations, the decision isn't made by comparing every available option. It's made by choosing from the small set of information that's available at that particular moment. That creates a kind of localized decision rather than one based on the full picture. In other cases, the person making the decision doesn't retain everything they first saw. Instead, they remember only one or two details that stood out the most during that initial glance. The rest isn't discarded because it doesn't matter. It's discarded because there simply isn't enough time to process everything at once. Under conditions like these, the decision-making process no longer resembles a full comparison between multiple options. It becomes a process of reducing information within an extremely narrow window of time. And it's that limitation that allows the same kind of decision to produce different outcomes, simply because the information was seen at a different moment. If you observe this pattern over and over, one thing becomes clear. It's not that people change the way they think from one moment to the next. It's that the amount of information they can retain during those brief windows is consistently limited by the same time structure. That creates small but continuous differences in how decisions take shape, not because the choices themselves are fundamentally different, but because the amount of information available at the moment of the decision is different. There's another factor that's rarely mentioned in situations like these. It's not simply a lack of time to process information. It's the fact that there's no longer enough room to place different choices side by side. When information is seen in separate pieces instead of all at once, the ability to compare naturally becomes narrower without any direct intervention. That narrowing shapes people's responses more than the information itself. And if moments like these happened only once, they wouldn't mean very much. But what makes them interesting is that they don't happen in isolation. They repeat themselves under different circumstances, with different people, and at different times of the day. At that point, they no longer have to be viewed as separate events. They can be seen as parts of a recurring pattern, even if no two moments look exactly the same. And once a pattern like that appears often enough, the question is no longer about any single moment. It's about what that repetition is gradually creating. Moments like these don't exist on their own. They repeat across different days, in different places, under different circumstances, but the structure inside them stays remarkably familiar. Limited time, limited information, and a sequence of responses unfolding within the same rhythm of movement. When you step back far enough, these moments stop looking like isolated events. They become a recurring rhythm woven into everyday life. You don't even have to give it a name. It still exists in the way one moment flows into the next. Some people go through it once a day, others experience it several times a week. Some move through it almost every day without noticing much difference from one time to the next. Not because their circumstances are exactly the same, but because the structure of those moments remains strikingly similar. And when a structure repeats often enough in everyday life, it begins to blend into the background. It no longer feels like a separate event. It becomes part of the underlying rhythm of daily living. From the outside, they're just brief actions that begin and end within seconds. But when you place them side by side, they aren't nearly as disconnected as they first appear. They're linked by the same limits on time and the same continuous flow from one step to the next. And over days, weeks, and beyond, that repetition begins to create something more significant than any individual moment. It gradually changes what people experience as normal. Not because everything suddenly becomes different, but because the boundaries between separate choices slowly blend into one continuous rhythm, where individual decisions no longer feel separate from one another. Nothing has to change within any single moment. If the pattern repeats long enough, the entire sequence naturally settles into a stable form that's difficult to recognize when you're only looking at small pieces. On a deeper level, what matters isn't simply that these actions repeat, it's that people begin doing them without having to consciously enter the decision-making process the way they once did. They become part of an automatic response, triggered in familiar situations without having to start from scratch each time. Not because people have changed the way they choose, but because certain choices have gradually become built-in responses within the structure of everyday life. But the important part isn't only that these moments repeat, it's where they begin appearing more and more often across different parts of daily life. They're no longer limited to one kind of situation. They begin showing up in activities that seem completely unrelated. And once that happens, the question is no longer how each individual moment works. It's how the entire rhythm of daily life has been arranged to contain moments like these. When a sequence of actions repeats often enough, it stops being seen as a collection of separate moments. It becomes part of the normal rhythm of everyday life. Not everyone experiences it in exactly the same way, but the same pattern of short, continuous, tightly structured blocks of time begins appearing more and more often throughout daily activities, from getting around to eating to the simplest parts of a personal routine. There are days when everything is scheduled almost back to back. Very little space remains between one activity and the next. Everything follows a fixed rhythm with almost no long pauses in between. In that kind of environment, choices no longer appear as separate decisions. They emerge as part of the timeline that's already unfolding. And when that rhythm continues day after day, it creates a way of living in which the steps between beginning and end gradually fade from attention. Not because they disappear, but because they happen so often that they no longer seem remarkable. From the outside, nothing appears to have changed very much, but when these moments are placed side by side, a clear pattern emerges in the way everything is divided into smaller pieces, organized and carried out within the same compressed windows of time. And it's that repetition that creates a stable foundation for everyday life, where small actions are no longer experienced as independent choices. They simply become part of the daily flow. If you look far enough ahead, you begin to see that it isn't any single action that's changing people. It's the way those actions keep repeating within the same structure of time that's gradually shaping the rhythm of everyday life. There are days that pass without leaving behind a single moment clear enough to remember, not because nothing happened, but because everything unfolded in such a familiar rhythm that one moment simply flowed into the next without ever creating a true pause. The morning begins with a list of things that need to get done. The afternoon is broken into small windows between one activity and another. By evening, your energy has dropped to its lowest point of the day. None of it feels dramatically different from the day before. It's simply the same structure repeating itself in different forms. And on days like these, there are tiny moments that usually go unnoticed. Someone sits in their car, glances at their phone for a few seconds, then turns into a familiar place. Nothing about that moment was planned. It simply happens while the day keeps moving forward. Some people pass through that moment without realizing they've done the same thing many times before, not because they aren't paying attention, but because it always happens under almost the same circumstances, the same time of day, the same level of exhaustion, the same brief gap between everything else that still needs to get done. And when that repeats often enough, the feeling that each day is different begins to fade, not all at once, but in a way that's almost impossible to notice in any single moment. The day is still complete, but the parts that once made it feel different become harder to recognize when you look back. And it's inside those tiny moments, the ones that receive almost no attention, that the structure of an entire day quietly begins taking shape again in the same familiar rhythm. Everything unfolds just as it always has. There's no major event that marks the difference. It's simply another evening coming to an end. Someone sits in a car while the lights outside reflect softly across the windshield. Nothing stands out. Nothing unusual happens. It's simply a brief pause in the middle of a long sequence of days that keeps moving forward. That person isn't thinking about everything that happened that day. They're not thinking about where the day began or everything that came before this moment. It's just a brief pause before continuing on. And then that moment passes too. There's no clear line between where it began and where it ended. Just another small piece of the day, quietly coming to a close without leaving behind anything that feels remarkable. From inside each individual moment, everything always seems perfectly normal. Nothing appears to be changing. There are no obvious breaking points, but from a little farther away, what stands out isn't any single moment by itself. It's the way those moments keep repeating within the same shape of everyday life. And maybe the most important thing isn't how everything changed. Maybe it's how so many things have become so ordinary that they no longer seem to deserve our attention. There isn't a clear ending to that. Time simply keeps moving forward the way it always has. And perhaps, after looking back at all of this, each person will recognize something different in their own experience. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video, I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective, not to agree or disagree, but simply to know how you feel about the repeating moments in your own everyday life. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments.